Good afternoon. Great pleasure to be here. I'm sorry to have missed the morning sessions and the ones yesterday, but I hope to catch up about what was said. To dive right into the subject for this afternoon session, let's talk a little briefly about the Girls' College at Aligarh, set up in 1906 in the Balai Qila neighborhood, the Upar Court as we call it in Aligarh, with 17 girls. This is initially called the Zanana Madarsa, then it comes to be known as the Girls' School, and eventually the Women's College as we know it today, where I think there are many alumni in this room from that college, and it operates under the university, Aligarh Muslim University. Also, I think the battles that were fought for the setting up of the school in 1906 by Sheikh Abdullah have changed by the time the Jamia Millia Islamia comes into being. Let's not forget that it takes 8 years after the passing away of Sir Sayyid for Sheikh Abdullah to set up the Women's College. Papa Mia's cherished dream was to have a normal school, as he calls it, a normal school. And by that, and he keeps using the word normal in his Mushahidat or Tasurat, he constantly talks about separate but equal schooling, meaning that the same sort of education that is being given to the boys, which means maths and science and hygiene and language, and also due attention to physical education, the same sort of schooling should be given to girls. So this idea of a normal school for girls, for female education, is very dear to Sheikh Abdullah, and it is a muhim, it is a crusade that he fights largely single-handedly. 1920, when Jamia comes along, there are other such schools. There is the Karamat Hussain School in Lucknow. There are the schools for women established by the Begums of Bhopal. There are the missionary schools. There's the IT college run by American missionaries, Isabella Thoburn College in Lucknow. There is a St. Mary's Convent in Lahore. So my own sense here is, and I'm going to learn a lot from the two speakers today, that women's education is not quite the battle it was 15 years ago when Sheikh Abdullah in 1906 is setting up the women's school. So let's have Shadab first talk about it, and then Lawrence. Is that okay? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Rakshanda, for giving kind of a brief about the foundation. And I think most of us know about the founding of the girls' school, so I won't be speaking so much on that. But I begin my presentation with discussing a bit about men in reforms and the women's education curriculum that was discussed thoroughly, and kind of a consensus that was arrived on what should be the women's education project and the curriculum. And the second part in bit about the consensus among women, the influence of the discourse, a very powerful discourse that came for almost the second half of 19th century, when women's education began to be discussed among men, and the influence it began to have, so that the first novel appears in 1881, and the magazines and the literature, we have been speaking so much about this Islahi literature. But at the same time, I'm also looking at the spaces that women tried to extend despite taking all this advice and the power of the discourse. That is the second part of it, but still I'll be briefly discussing, and I'm discussing primarily all this to speak about the school curriculum or the education curriculum for girls that came to be a larger normative and a larger discourse that was already set in when women's education or the school that came up was conceived and it came about. And the important concern of this paper is primarily to retrieve the role and the work of Wahid Jahan, that has been a lot hidden by the tall personality of Sheikh Abdullah, who is seen as the main founder of the school, and much of the hard work that had went into the foundation of the school, even though Sheikh Abdullah gives a lot of credit to his wife in both Mushahidat and the biography that he has written, still we need to retrieve much of what the person she was, and the agency, the creativity, and also if it is possible to know her, also the tensions and the conflict that might have been there, if it is possible for us to retrieve from the biography. So here I am actually not bringing in some very new source or something that has not been written, but I'm looking into an autobiography and the text that has already been written, and what sense does it make to the women's education curriculum and the kind of education that was imparted. And then I'm, so it is looking at the objectives primarily of the school and the project that is there, but at the same time I'm also towards the end of it looking at the spaces that was extended by the founder, and also the limitations and the outcome of the school and the women's education. Something that I would let me also tell my own background or something of my researches, so that how I got interested into it, because I have been teaching in women's college and have been a student of that college, and it has been quite some very persisting issues that we invoke traditions of the founding of the college, the traditions that even today is being invoked, that it is kind of, it came at the time of Sheikh Abdullah. All that made me interested into looking into the history of our foundation. Even though I'm a medievalist, I'm doing history in medieval India, and my area is gender in medieval India. But I became interested in the history of Muslim women's education and the reform movement on account of my experience of teaching and the issues that we still deal with on the campus. So the first part, men in Aligarh movement and women's education discourse. If I have the mouse, I can click it myself. So this is actually not needed so much. But the PowerPoint was there so that you can focus on what I am trying to say, and mainly the main points. I'm looking at Aligarh, and which obviously assumed a center stage also in the discussion of Muslim women's education. As Muslim women's education project was conceived within the larger Aligarh movement for Muslim women's education, and it was not separate from it. And here I am looking at I'm looking at the objectives, concerns, initiatives, efforts, and competition among the men in reform in arriving at the women's education discourse. Men, for different reasons, became interested in reform, building a strong discourse on women's education, common to the larger understanding among male reformers across communities, but also unique to the social and community milieu of the Muslim elite men. The discourse for Muslim women's education being guided by the same logic of suitable education for women, education to lighten the households and necessary for women as upholders of tradition at home. Women will have special role and status as markers of culture and mistress of the spiritual cultural domain of the home, that was the inner retreat and sanctuary from colonial humiliation, and were expected to take up their special role with untiring zest and responsibility. For the community, it was to play as key to advancement of Muslim community in India, one that would strengthen the culture from within and contribute to renewed pride and affirmation of cultural and religious identity. Besides, this would lead to, as in other communities, in giving the needed identity to the elite who took to social leadership and political ascendancy, through the movement. The persistent manner in which the issue of Muslim women's education was taken up by men, even though there were very few in the women's education section, likewise, speaks of the importance of the issue of women's education assumed by this time, which men in the movement sought to grab and try to carve their niche in the movement. There appears also a tough competition among men on this men, even when they were few, and we see Muhammad Ali and Sheikh Abdullah and Shaukat Ali, they're kind of a tussle, and Shaukat Ali actually speaking of and very critical of Sheikh Abdullah that he's flying away with his ideas of holding exhibitions and holding women's meetings. There has been disagreement on school education and nature of school, from homebound as more appropriate for women to normal school, as Rakshanda was saying, for training of ustanis that would deliver to the girls of elite families. And that is the reason why normal school initially was the idea, whether the normal school to train the ustanis will be in Aligarh or will be in Lahore. That has been one of the major debates in the women education section meeting. To a proper school for girls for education, which emerged more out of financial considerations that need for learning than the need for learning in a different academic setting outside home. There was, however, by and large, a general consensus built over time on the content of education suitable for women. An education curriculum different from that of boys, as we see a very strong influence of separate spheres ideology. I bring in Sir Syed Ahmad Khan as the issue of women's education came to be discussed way back, went as far as allowing not only homebound and traditional education for women, fearing Muslim modern education for girls to be threatening to the moral social order. Women's education projects, as if by agreement, moved in the direction of creating an ideal woman. The figure of the ideal woman, educated and trained in domesticity, cultured and religious in behavior, responsible and dutiful towards senior members of the family, better managers of the household and its resources, were qualities in women common to the agenda of reform and revival in the 19th century. There were, however, certain prescriptions specific to Muslim women, and primarily with regard to Parda, which was being reconstituted under the current circumstances. Parda, being a practice desired and sanctioned by religion, was also a symbol of their status and dominant ruling culture. And Muslim elite, though had lost power, their past glory and prestige could be recreated and relived through Parda observed by their women. So Parda, though under attack by the colonial rulers, was to be negotiated and reinterpreted by the struggling Muslim elite, not as an impediment to women's education, rather education and advancement of women, according to them, could take place effectively despite Parda. The model of female protagonists by the didactic texts, Miratul Uruz and Banatun Nash, Majalis Nisa, creates that ideal woman figure as strong characters who take charge of their homes and combat moral and cultural decline. Clearly, for the need to adjust to the demands of the new age, there was not invoking the figure of a new modern woman, but of a well-adjusted and disciplined figure who would guard and uphold the traditions and values, qaida, of their homes. The learning and the reform for women accordingly could be carried out in Parda and in special arrangements for learning at home, and in similarly special ways in Parda when they moved out to study in school. We see a very strong influence of this discourse and women too in consensus. The power of the discourse was strong enough to influence women who began to write and contributed to women's magazine, advocating for women's education on these lines, and who became active in reform. I have primarily the content of education in mind that all this was arriving at. These are primarily women belonging to the family of reformers, and a common ideological ground was struck over the form and the content of education. The consensus for suitable education for women formed the basis of the curriculum when education moved to the school. These women writings were as much didactic, suggesting a suitable form of education, and piecemeal reforms to enable them to perform their duties better, to perform their duties to their husbands and families better, and for companionship to husbands. The excessive form of parda, for instance, was critiqued as customary parda, unnecessary, while protection for male gaze was considered shari and was institutionalized as legitimate parda. Parda norms were accepted and reconstituted on guided lines, enabling women to move from home to school, advocating certain specific forms of parda as a matter of reformed Muslim practice, thereby entrenching the elite respectability norms further, in which women were as much agents and partners in the process. It is okay, it has come. Yeah. So it was this founding of school which, with a carefully worked out agenda for guarded education and for guarded reform and education. This naturally had to take into account all the requirements of the education for girls according to Sharif values and ethos, while Sir Sayyid's emphasis on the need for Aligarh male students was to break away from the stultifying influence of traditional family life. But for women students, as it came out to be by early 20th century, they were to remain tied to the Sharif family traditions, and the curriculum at school recreated and emphasized the similarity between the home and the school. Education for girls should not appear threatening, but women be taught the lessons of observance, obedience, and respect for authority. The school for Sharif girls was to take up the task previously undertaken by the household ustanis. Initially, later, there were subjects that was added by government's intervention, as it is mentioned in Savani Umri. These were to impart training to women in household subjects, Urdu, basic arithmetics, needlework, religious instructions with elementary knowledge of account keeping, etc. More importantly, the school had to meet the strict parda conditions, and elaborate arrangements of parda were to be made not only to convince parents to send their daughters to school, but to meet the oppositions of powerful notables of the Aligarh College. For after all, women's education project was conceived within the bigger Aligarh movement. This forms the background to Wahid Jahan's contribution in the founding of school. It is in against this backdrop that we need to look at the contribution of Wahid Jahan, the founder of the girls' school at Aligarh. From the founding of the initial girls' school to the real work of running and managing the boarding school for girls on a day-to-day basis, Wahid Jahan, the wife of Sheikh Abdullah, had a very special role to play. The social milieu of the times required the schoolgirls to be worked only through women, a reason why Muslim men in reform sought educated women in marriage, or sought to educate their wives to open up girls' schools and to work out reforms in the segregated realm. It was through the wife that he could gain the needed access to the segregated setting of the women's world, and the wife would work as his deputy and agent in reform. However, her initiatives and endeavors for the school went much beyond just being supportive of her husband. In the face of general conservatism and opposition to the school, Abdullahs had to convince parents to send their daughters to school, for which stricter norms of parda were to be followed. I'm not giving the details of it because it's there in Savani Umri, the details of Wahid Jahan's contribution, of how she took very tender care of the children like her mother. She took very special care and special needs of the Sharif girls who were to be made to feel home. All these required great efforts and personal vigilance and strenuous involvement on an everyday basis, so much so that she started to live in the hostels with her elder daughters for close supervision of her wards and school affairs. One of the teachers of the school speak about her that she was a pivot around whom the whole campus existed, and one who has brought the school into being. Closely scrutinized by the parents of the girls in her charge and by the ardent critics of the school, she was expected to perform diligently and enforce the rules of parda and the suitable education curriculum for women. Her husband and biographer has described her efforts and involvement at school in her biography in a very cut and dried style, speaking of her primarily as his dutiful wife, following and fulfilling his dreams and directions, projecting her as a role model for her unassuming work and efforts in silence and in parda, thereby cutting an idealized figure of a person in line with how reformists had produced ideal, disciplined women through education project. Very little could we know of her personality through such description that is more written with a reformist zeal. Fortunately, we have other writings, and we have women's college magazines, the early issues from which I've tried to retrieve something, besides the memoirs of Khurshid Mirza, her daughter, who presents her mother in a very different light. And so it's possible to recover some spaces and some possibilities through these writings. Though she worked by and large, Wahi Jahan worked by and large according to the influential gender ideology of the elite circle at Aligarh, sharing as much the same worldview, she also appears perceptive to the modern advances and changes becoming available to women of our times, which gradually could open up for her girls too, more for her daughters and some for her fictive daughters, the students at the boarding. Khurshid Jahan, I'm sorry, I'm not giving the trajectory of the founding of the girls' school at the old city area and then the boarding school. I think that is quite a common knowledge with this gathering. So I have moved to the forming of this boarding school, which was also termed as Parde Ka boarding by Sheikh Abdullah himself. And I'm discussing all that in that context. Khurshid Mirza brings out Wahid Jahan's initiative in taking the girls out for picnics and in arranging for senior girls' trip to Aligarh Numaish, that is Aligarh exhibition at night, while the younger ones could go in the daytimes. All of this appears to be big matter for which considerable arrangements were made. Spaces were also extended by the young teachers at school and women residents of the boarding, some by the space generated within an all-women milieu itself, and some by contestations to the constrictions and limitations at the school. Notably, the first-generation learners were conscious of the changes coming their way and their negotiations for greater liberty in life and for learning. Khurshid Jahan speaks of a number of initiatives taken by young staff. Girls from the school could recite in the annual Aligarh exhibition. Trips of women students for tournaments to other women's college campuses were arranged. The screen that had been before Sheikh Abdullah when he addressed the students got removed when Ismat Chughtai wrote scathingly against the practice, saying that it is a shame that daughters were observing parda with their Papa Mia. Sheikh Abdullah was addressed like that by the students, as we all know. From Khurshid's description, Wahid Jahan appears Wahid Jahan appears very perceptive to the changing times, and parda was increasingly getting interpreted liberally. Khurshid Jahan considers her mother Wahid Jahan as a much more liberal person at home than her father, and fondly recounts the liberties extended to the girls of Abdullah family by her initiatives and the rules of parda relaxing at home. She confronted Sheikh Abdullah when he insisted the young daughters, Birjiz and Khurshid, to wear burqa, and Wahid Jahan says, she says, Dulha Mia, the way she addressed him, I am in parda and shall observe it in front of your friends till the day I die. Maybe the elder girls, her daughters, will have to wear a burqa in Aligarh. But these two younger ones, Khurshid and Birjiz, never will, except when they go out with the hostel girls. I have seen too much harm done to girls in parda observing homes. Most of them become tubercular through lack of fresh air. The time is gone when we put little girls like Khurshid behind parda. She stuck to extending liberties to her daughters, and they spoke of the vibrant environment at home, the meetings and the discussions and the consequent impact of their lives. And Khurshid also describes how even the elder girls will stop observing parda at home with the male servants, and this was not a problem, something that was encouraged by Wahid Jahan at home. So this was quite a perplexing matter for very senior older ladies, but things were changing at home. However, Wahid Jahan, though almost a daughter to boarding girls, and one who took exceptionally good care of these daughters, and there are also descriptions of how on Sundays she will clean the girls of the lice and everything, and she will taste the dish, everything done very meticulously. So she took exceptionally good care of the students at the boarding. But regarding these liberties, she didn't take the same approach toward the liberties of these daughters who were, after all, oh my God. No, I have 30 minutes. 30 minutes are over. Okay. Right. Wahija, though almost yes. But she didn't have the same approach to the liberties of these daughters who were, after all, in safekeeping, and their families had reposed trust in school. Clearly, the reform and the modern education did not mean the same for students of the girls' school and for their daughters. To keep up the reputation of Parda institution, Wahija herself observed Parda all her life. Notably, it was this particular virtue that Sheikh Abdullah so proudly mentions the opening lines of Sawani Umri. Begum was a Parda Nashi Muslim woman. This is the line with which he opens her biography. Clearly, for the prestige of the Parda institution, its founder and the students would remain in Parda. The founders continue to fear the conservative backlash against the school if more freedom was allowed to girls, so that the part enforced as essential got institutionalized, fixing its nature and rendering it more respectable. Regarding outcome, the outcome does not always follow the guided path, and despite the powerful narrative of suitable education for women, women did right, extending and pushing as to what was allowed, even though what they were advocating was halting and piecemeal. But they spoke of modern times and the need for change, which meant different things for different people, allowing some space for newer conversations and igniting new visions of the world for women learners who became increasingly exposed to new ideas. Women, though in the hostels, were viewing the change in their social milieu, families and families of their known ones. Women began to move in and out Parda depending on the setting, remove their burqas if certain that they were not being recognized. And the experiments at school were perhaps encouraged by the other developments in the 1920s and the 30s, when Muslim families also began to bring their women out of Parda, and there were more organized mixed parties, and women were abandoning Parda. There were mixed clubs, and women learned to drive motor cars. So all these developments began to impact also perhaps encourage the developments and the changes in the school. And the boarding otherwise also could not be insulated from the outside influences and was still beyond the control of strict disciplinarians. And we see how the literary world was, the literary writings came to influence the hostel girls. I will very quickly move this slide. Okay. Okay, right. So I move now to Rashid Jahan, the eldest daughter of the founders. And I see this as a sharp break from what the liberal reforms and women's education project offered. Of course, education imparted had defined objects and content, but would produce varied outcomes for students. Having received higher education outside the Aligarh school and gradually moving out of Parda, she was keen to extend the liberal and revolutionary ideas, and she was acquiring through higher education an association with a wider circle in Aligarh and outside. Her speech in the school inspired young girls like Ismat, who wrote that her preoccupation with romantic stories vanished in thin air after listening to her. We do not know the content of her speech, but she appeared radical and impressive in a sari with a sleeveless blouse and a bobbed hair in her 20s, and she was reprimanded by Begum Sultan Jahan for her outspoken speech, perhaps regarded as improper for the college girls. Her unusual upbringing and liberal background, though, offered her considerable liberties compared to other Muslim females. Still, the reforms and the liberal character of education do not sufficiently explain either the radical person that Rashid Jahan had to become or the causes for which she was so fearlessly outspoken. Influenced by the radical ideologies, her exceptionality lies in her ability, despite the limitations, to associate with militant men and form a club that launched a ferocious attack on Muslim society's abuse and iniquities, which were never spoken before in any direct way. We have spoken so much about Angare, which was a frontal attack, not only on outdated customs, traditional customs, but the entire gamut of entrenched Sharif respectability norms and the values of Sharif households, only negligibly altered by reform. In her frank portrayal of the lives of the Muslim women, speaking about things that were taboo to speak, without a concern for social censure, she in her writings in Angare and the more radical ones that appeared even later controverted what the Muslim education project was proposing and had proposed. Rashid's radicalism and her writings were a considerable embarrassment to her parents and, more importantly, threatened the credibility of their educational reforms for women. The founders and the advocates of Muslim women's education too were perplexed by the attacks on Rashid Jahan, getting redirected to the Abdullah Girls' School, as the curriculum offered at school was strengthening the values of elite Muslim households and reconstituting the elite respectability in changing times, and was in no way challenging it. Her radicalism could not be seen in a simple linear progression of the liberal project becoming sharper and militant with time in its reform agenda, but in sharp rejection of the previous trend of what Muslim liberal reforms offered to women, which accommodated rather than challenged the oppressive familial social norms, a problem that was taken up for immediate attention by young Muslims who were being increasingly radicalized by the growing critical trends in politics and literature in the early decades of 20th century. And Rashid, a woman member in the group, was of course an exception. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadab.